I want to welcome you all to the June Gate Equity 201 webinar. We're going to give everybody a few more minutes to enter the room. I see people are still coming in. We'll start like in 1 minute. We'll give them a chance to enter and possibly download a copy of the slides from our webpage. Okay, I know.
I got 3 plants I need to.
I know we have people that are still going to join us. It's 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon in June. That's you're all really busy. I know that, so we're going to honor your time. I want to welcome you to the Gate Equity webinar series. I'm Bonnie Zimmerman, Tiered Supports Program Specialist, and today we're going to talk about improvement science and driving equitable supports with the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, also known as the TFI. This meeting is being recorded live on YouTube. We're going to drop the PowerPoint in the chat for you, but it's also posted on OSPI's webpage on the Gate Equity webinar page if you want to follow along. We're also we offer closed captioning. You can turn on subtitles. If you have difficulty with this, just let somebody in the chat know and we'll see if we can assist you. In case you didn't know it, and we tell you this every single month, OSPI has a YouTube channel. We're trying to get to 5,000 viewers. So if you want to, if you aren't already subscribed, please go to OSPI, subscribe for their YouTube channel. That way, if you can't make it to one of our webinars or you want to share a recording, all you have to do is subscribe. And then by clicking the little bell, you'll get alerts each time we post a new video. We love to see our listeners get clock hours for joining us. Partial clock hours are available if you can only make it to one of the webinars. We'll drop the link in the chat if you'd like to participate. If you do decide not to participate in the breakout, we're not going to do a breakout room today, so I can skip that part. This is just a reminder. It's helpful to all of us if you introduce yourself to the group to help add context to our conversation. You go to the participants list, click on more, and rename yourself, just your name, your role, whether you're a teacher, administrator, school counselor, social worker, community partner, and what grade band you work with. That would be great. This webinar is brought to you through the Office of System and School Improvement within the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. At OSPI, we believe each student needs to be prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. The Gate Equity webinar was created with the purpose of highlighting practices that increase access to education and ultimately to graduation. It's another beautiful day in Olympia. I happen to live on the traditional lands of the Nisqually tribe, but I'm in Olympia today and broadcasting from the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island people. We ask that the participants of this meeting also honor the traditional lands on which each of you are located today. If you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements, it is best practice for districts to engage in tribal consultation with the tribes nearest their district to determine their historical lands. Each tribe are experts of their own history. We'll paste some links in the chat that we hope you'll explore. In our office, we have created a cultural acknowledgement that helps to ground our work. We want to acknowledge the pain and trauma resulting from over 400 years of racism in the United States and against people of the African diaspora. We stand with our communities of color during these unprecedented times of civil unrest, especially those who identify as and/or are categorized as Black and/or African American. We will continue to center our work in leading with racial equity. We want to offer a moment of silence and afterwards honor the space for people from communities of color to respond to this acknowledgement first. Then we invite allies and others to communicate their comments after. If you're more comfortable, please use the chat box. We invite accountability and partnership and hope you'll support us as we continue to grow. We're going to pause for 1 minute now to reflect. Okay, now I want to open the floor for our listeners from communities of color. If you want to respond to this acknowledgement first. If you'd prefer to use the chat, go ahead and do so. I just want to say that Kepi and I have used this cultural acknowledgement at each of our Gateway webinars this year, and we believe wholeheartedly in what it says and represents. And as a department, OSPI, we are committed to leading with equity. I'd also like to thank my coworker, Akiva, for sharing these slides with me. I'd like you to know that later this month on Saturday, June 19th, it's the holiday of Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day. It's a holiday celebrating the emancipation of those who were enslaved in the United States. In June is LGBTQ Pride Month. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer Pride Month is currently celebrated each year in the month of June. In our objectives today, you should be able to answer the following questions by the end of today's webinar. What is the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI? Who should use it and when? What data from the TFI will inform the school improvement plan? And how can the TFI be used for action planning? With us today are Liza Hartlyn, Assistant Director of Continuous Improvement at OSPI, and RJ Monton, Assistant Director of MTSS at OSPI. I want to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to present at our very last Gate Equity webinar for the 2021 school year. And right now I'm going to launch a poll, and we're going to ask you who you are with, you know, what your, who's here, what grade, or what grade band you work with, and how familiar you are with our topic today. Thank you. And whoever launched that for me, thank you. And we'll give you a couple minutes because you do have to answer all 3 questions in order for it to count before you hit submit. If you don't see the 3 questions, you can scroll down before you hit submit and answer them all. We'll give you a little bit of time. And Liza, if you want to take over.
Hi, thanks, Bonnie. I was trying to figure out my slides. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. um, good morning. I am Liza Hartlyn, she, her pronouns, and I am joining all of you from the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island tribe here in the old Capitol building in downtown Olympia. And I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. And I'm really excited to be having this learning conversation with our assistant director for MTSS here at OSPI with RJ Monton. So today we're going to be talking about how to use the Tiered Fidelity Inventory to drive equitable supports within the continuous school improvement planning process. So before we get into all of that, we're really just going to talk about what MTSS is and what continuous improvement is. So I'm going to pass this over to my friend RJ, who's going to talk about what MTSS looks like in Washington State.
Excellent. Thank you, Liza. So MTSS, or multi-tiered system of supports within Washington State, really it builds upon the public health approach. It's a preventative system that focuses on organizing the efforts of adults essentially within systems to be more efficient and effective with their practice. It really does help to ensure students benefit from those nurturing environments and provides equitable access to universal instruction and supports that are, again, culturally, linguistically responsive, universally designed and differentiated to meet all of our students' unique needs.
Awesome, thanks, RJ. And a quick overview of how the Office of System and School Improvement defines the essential elements for continuous school improvement. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the School Improvement Plan, which is an element of what continuous school improvement is all about. But really the idea of elevating, recognizing, implementing anti-racist practices, identifying and providing opportunities for growth within equitable supports within learning communities. So if you've read our equity statement at OSPI, it identifies a number of student groups, as well as talking about the understanding historical and traumatic implications, as well as engaging communities and then identifying processes and practices around how to dismantle some of those inequitable things that come to those student groups. We're also looking at how to develop strong leadership at all levels, and that includes from student and classroom level all the way up through. Using data inquiry and improvement science principles to really look at and systematically understand what needs to be improved and how are we making progress. And then really focusing in on core instructional practices, best practices, evidence-based practices, and then implementing multi-tiered systems of support. So how are we ensuring that the system to support learning within the learning community is being supported and ensuring that it's providing those equitable supports. So now that we've established what MTSS in Washington State is and what continuous improvement is, and hopefully you all can see overlaps, we're now going to get into the meat of today's webinar. So I wanted to return back to our objectives. I'm kind of a big proponent of 7 times 7 ways. So RJ and I are really going to talk about and define what the Tiered Fidelity Inventory is, or TFI. Who should use it and when, so that there's a really understanding of like, what is the tool, who within the school community and district community uses it, when do you use it, when is it the most appropriate, and then what kinds of data will you be getting from it to inform the school improvement plan and the process, because there's lots of different ways that you can use this information, and then how can it be used for action planning? So it's not just something that you're like, oh, here's data, it's gonna sit on the shelf, but like, what are next steps around using this tool? So before we start, we really kind of want to get some background information about what is your familiarity with TFI. So Bonnie is gonna launch a poll for us so that we can get some information from all of you. So take a moment, read the options, and then click the one that best represents your experience.
Liza, while they're doing that, I can tell you that we have teachers in the audience. They're mostly secondary teachers, but there are some elementary school teachers there, and they're somewhat familiar with, according to our Who's Here poll.
Excellent. So RJ, it looks like the majority of the people in our audience are in the never heard of it and heard of it but don't know much about it category. And then we have probably about a quarter to 2/3 of people or a third of people who have dabbled with it, feel competent, or could teach it. So just a heads up of where we're at when we go into the detail level of the next part.
Okay.
All right. So RJ, can you tell me what the Tiered Fidelity Inventory is?
Yeah, so the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, the TFI, is, it came about, it is a measure, so where it separates itself from sort of outcome data. So we see outcome data from students and from staff all the time, and that's what we typically measure our success upon. But the Tiered Fidelity Inventory it takes a different look at sort of our adult behavior within a system. So it's a measure of how well we are doing the work, essentially. So it's that fidelity measure of our school-wide PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports. It's a measure of how well we're implementing that overall system. And it's yeah, I mean, it's a two-part process. There's both a questionnaire and a walkthrough component, but it's ultimately, like I said, a measure of how implemented or how well we are doing the work we said we're going to do.
Excellent. So I don't like to make assumptions about what people do and don't know. So can you tell me a little bit more about what school-wide positive behavior intervention and supports is, since this is a tool that really measures how well we're using and implementing that specifically? Yeah,
of course. So, I mean, school-wide PBIS. So PBIS is, again, I guess the more classic explanation of PBIS, it's sort of like a 3-tiered model based on a public health model for providing students with everything they need to be successful in school. So the tier 1, or our universal supports, are those supports that all students should have access through their day or through the course of their schooling. Tier 2, or those secondary supports, are those supports set up for students who need some extra support to maintain with their peers. And then tier 3 are those highly individualized supports for some students who need some individualization of their day or components of their education to be successful with their peers. It models the public health model, where it's like, if we were to use an example, it'd be like, it's a preventative model. So everyone has access to, we make sure we all have access to soap and clean water to keep our hands clean, and then we know that during cold and flu season, some folks need, to get a flu shot to be able to maintain, healthy lifestyles with their peers. And then we also know that there's some people who have some individualized needs because of immune systems, where they might need Tamiflu every year just to maintain a healthy winter or healthy flu season with their peers. That's sort of like a very basic way of looking at it. But really, PBIS and MTSS, sort of, going even further, is a framework that really allows for adults to be more efficient and more impactful with their own behavior to provide positive student outcomes. It becomes that framework that reduces barriers for the teacher to provide supports for the students, and really focuses on trying to make as many things universally available as possible, and limit the amount of interventions and supports we have to do, because we're providing good core instruction and good core supports for all students. So it's really the framework for how the adults do their behavior within the school system.
Okay, so to summarize that last sentence you said, is that the TFI, like if I were to say this in 1 to 3 sentences, the TFI is a way to measure the implementation of adult behavior around how you're differentiating needed supports for students in the school building. Is that
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So then my next question is, can you tell me kind of how it's broken down, what types of questions are involved within this, within the TFI?
So yeah, so the TFI basically has, we call it 45 criterion or 45 different things a school's universal team or a school team would rate themselves on. So it covers things as far as like, do you have a team? Do you have defined team roles? Do you have, meeting agendas? So it looks at all these internal processes, and you score yourself on a scale of 0, 1, or 2. Kind of how well you're doing with it as a team. And it's broken down into 3 tiers. There's certain team functions at tier 1, there's certain team functions, within tier 2 systems, and team functions at tier 3. And again, it's a measure of how well you're doing any one of these 45 elements that are sort of boiled down to like, these are the necessary components to have a successful MTSS or PBIS system going on in your building or in your district. So and again, I think I said earlier, there's these 2 parts to it. There's like sort of like this universal team rating, where you sit down with, most of the time, an external coach that comes in and supports you. But there's also a walkthrough component where somebody will come into your building, or somebody will conduct this walkthrough, and they'll go around and they'll interview students, and they'll interview staff. Do you know your school-wide behavior expectations? What are they? What do they mean to you? When's the last time you were recognized for your positive behavior? And the last similar things of staff. Have you explicitly taught your school-wide expectations or classroom expectations? And when's the last time you recognized a student for meeting those expectations? So it's a measure of not only kind of how the team believes they're functioning, but also sort of how far down the hallway the message has gotten. It's like, is it all the way at the classroom at the end? And are those teachers and students feeling the impacts, of it? So it's kind of a 2-part sort of stress test on your PBIS system within your building.
So it's kind of measures end user experience as well as like implementer experience. Is that
correct? Yeah, and then
yeah.
Yeah, and that walkthrough informs a couple of the criterion within the team rating. So like, actually the team can't answer. There's a couple questions they can't answer without the walkthrough data. So so you could score yourself for like, yeah, we're doing great as a team, but if teachers aren't actually teaching expectations, then there's a disconnect or a knowledge gap there.
Awesome. All right, so my next big question and the next thing that we're going to address within the objectives of this webinar is, who should use this tool and when? And I've heard you say a lot of like teams use this, teams are supposed to use this. So who makes up this team of users, or who's asking or filling out or completing this particular TFI?
So yeah, so there's all schools. I mean, so in order for this to be done with accuracy, it has to be sort of a universal team within the building. And in many cases, these teams already exist. I think George Sagai would say, like, George Sagai was like sort of, I guess, the Yoda of PBIS, so to speak. Like he was born with the triangle tattoo, but I think he would say, like, don't create a team you don't have to. So if your school already has like a leadership team, just make sure they have like the requisite expertise is on that team. You have some administrative support, you have grade level, or in the case of secondary, you have content level support on your team. And make sure you have someone with some behavioral expertise, and make sure nurse and other support staff are represented on this team. So depending on the size of your school, make sure it's big enough to sort of like get all points of view, but also not so big that you have sort of like the team size paralysis. But it really should be like that universal team. So like kind of all viewpoints are heard within the building. And then, so that makes up your universal team. I think if we were to look through a pure lens of, PBIS, we would call it a tier 1 team. And it would be really about sort of like just looking at PBIS. But I think oftentimes when we do that, we inadvertently silo. So don't create a team you don't have to, if you already have one that exists, but it should be a team that comprises, you know, plenty of expertise in like all corners of the building. So yeah, so you said, you know, sorry, your first question was what, who makes up, so that they make, like, that would be the team basically.
Okay, so the team is like a universal kind of like represented every, like all aspects of the learning community and the PBIS, like a good functioning PBIS team essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. So then who answers these questions? Is it that team that goes through and goes through the 45 questions and answers them?
Yeah, so I guess in an ideal situation, an external coach would come in and facilitate the team through answering the questions. Because I mean, we all know that if we answer a question and it's, so if I'm the principal of a building and I come in and I administer the TFI with my team, if I say, hey, what do we think about this? I'm feeling like it's a 2. Oftentimes we get sort of like the passive, like, yeah, it's a 2. It's really great when an external coach kind of comes in as a neutral party, just saying like, okay, like, how do people feel as far as like team composition? You know, does the team exist but doesn't have all the identified roles, or are we existing with the roles and everyone's here more than 80% of the time? And you kind of get like a general consensus of like, all right, I'm seeing some 1s and 2s. If there isn't like a unanimous agreement on that team, that's when you pause and have a discussion. And it's just like, okay, well, are we here all the time? Are we like, or are we missing a few of the roles? So it's one of these things where, you know, having been a person who's facilitated this quite a bit, you're like, oh, we're kind of a 1.5. It's like, well, if you're a 1.5, you're a 1. And there's nothing wrong with being like not rating yourself as a 1 here, because that's sort of like, okay, cool. Like team composition, we're a 1. You know, it's a fidelity check. It's not a grade. We're not submitting this for a merit increase of any kind. But really what the fidelity inventory helps us do by answering these questions is shows us where to focus some of our efforts on school-wide improvement, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit.
All right, thank you for that explanation of who should be on this team, and then best practice around your principal is not the one who should be engaging in the administration, but somebody, an external neutral party, if you want like the real deal honesty of where you're at. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So now that we've talked about what it is, and we've talked about who is supposed to kind of participate and administer and collect the data on this, how is it used? Like, what's the initial application for what the TFI was designed for? What kind of information do you get from it?
So originally it was designed as a way to as like a stress test or a check for like how well we are implementing our PBIS systems. So are we teaming? Are we making data-based decisions? Are we explicitly teaching our classroom or school-wide expectations? Are we recognizing them, you know, at a rate frequent enough that we're providing for positive student change? Basically, the TFI was that adult behavior check for our student outcome data that we were already getting, because we were getting like office referrals, we were getting suspension. So it was like, all right, if we're making some sort of a change, we have no way of measuring it internally except for student outcomes. So we have no way of determining whether or not our adult, you know, educational professional behavior has had an effect on student outcomes. So the TFI was designed for the PBIS component of that. So like the behavioral and the social emotional component of school. It was a way to measure how well essentially we as adults were behaving in that system to affect positive student outcomes. So that was the original measure. So it was a way of checking how our systems were progressing over time. Were they improving? Where were they improving? Were they not improving? Why weren't they improving? So. Okay.
Before we move on, there are 2 questions in the chat that I want to address. So the first one is, what is fidelity improvement? So if we can address that one, I think it will help with some sense making.
So yeah, so fidelity improvement, and I think we'll probably touch on this in a slide in a little bit, but fidelity improvement is essentially looking at, so the fidelity. So we'll take teaching of school-wide expectations as an isolated example. If we're seeing that we're not doing that with consistency, that becomes something we as a school would focus on for all teachers and all staff to explicitly teach school-wide expectations. So that way we turned around and ran the tier fidelity inventory again. We would say like, okay, cool. We've seen an increase in the fidelity to which we have been teaching. Like we've been explicitly teaching it the way we agreed to, rather than saying like, yep, we have school-wide expectations, they're on the wall, student outcomes haven't improved. So it's the idea of like, okay, no, like we're missing that piece in between, the actual teaching piece. So that would be the fidelity improvement. That would be an improvement in fidelity. We would see an increase in one of those areas or one of those criterion on the TFI.
Awesome, thank you. And then the next one is, does the school district come up with the plan? And Kathleen, we're actually going to get into that in a couple of slides. So if you can sit tight, and if we don't answer your question, then please bring it back up. Okay, so just quick recap. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about who uses it, the original applications for what it is. But as I've learned from you and in conversations with you, that this is kind of a limited application, that the TFI has so much other potential uses. Can you talk about those expanded potentials and how that can, and then kind of move into how that really can steer or inform school improvement planning processes?
Yeah, so I think the original intent behind the TFI was to, as a measure of how well, when we're building our internal PBIS or MTSS systems, it was a measure of how well we're doing with our construction. Basically, are we keeping up with external environmental changes? But I think some of the expanded potentials are when we look at like, okay, when we're not, or something isn't improving, or we aren't seeing growth somewhere, we can look down at a granular level and look at like within just this tool itself, we can look at the why it's not improving. So rather than making like large sweeping changes, I think for those of us who've been working in public school long enough, we know that oftentimes this is when the bathwater gets tossed out, and oftentimes the baby with it, when something's not going well, it's like, okay, move into a new curriculum, move into a new idea. The TFI, the way it's layered, we can look with a granular nature and be like, okay, hold on. Rather than a sweeping change, we're going to make some precise, discrete changes in our systems to provide positive student outcomes. I hate to say it, but the TFI allows us to be as lazy as possible. What I mean by that is it allows us to make the smallest change for the greatest impact. We know adults don't like change. Most of us don't. It's hard to do. We have our patterns. So if we can make small changes to provide for larger student impacts, we're going to do that. And the TFI allows us through some of the reports you can pull out of it to look at like, all right, what are those small areas, or what's the place where we could have the greatest amount of leverage, without having to change everyone's behavior. If it's like, oh, cool, we just have to reroute the way the buses go through the parking lot, and that'll totally change student behavior coming in because students are on time. Like, there are subtle things you can kind of dig out of the TFI that you can't if you're just looking at we're at 80%. It's like, well, what does that mean? If you dig down, you can see why you're not at 100%, where you might be able to make some subtle changes.
All right. Okay, I like that example of the bus, because sometimes something simple as that really does have a huge impact.
Well, just as an anecdotal story, I was working with a school a couple of years ago, and they were saying like, oh, we're having a problem with physical like interactions in the playground. It's the fifth graders or something like that. And in looking through some of their data and looking through their TFI, like we sort of like dug down and it was like, no, like you don't have a playground issue, you have a transition issue when it's time for fifth grade to be done and first grade to go out. It was something like that. It was just like, if we go in this door, like we literally changed the door that the playground went in. It reduced behavior by like like 50%. It was crazy. Like just the subtle change of a door was all we needed.
And that's information you can get from the TFI.
Yeah. Oh, well, the TFI, but so probably where we balance the TFI with some student outcome data. Yeah.
Awesome. So quick like clarification. This tool should be used in conjunction and collaboration with other data that's being collected.
Correct. So this is that fidelity measure. So this is that tool that measure that you would use to triangulate with outcome measures as well. So whether it's grades or behavioral data, this is a tool that you would use to balance off of that.
Okay. So it's used in collaboration. It's another piece of like what might be a root cause or what might be another issue we haven't been paying attention to.
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we've been showing like different types of data that we can get off of this. Can you dig in and tell us a little bit more about what kinds of information we're getting like from these data reports and then how schools can use them?
So yeah, so I think looking at the reports, like if you go through you answer all 45 criterion, and you basically score yourself as a team. 0, meaning like not in place. 1 is partially in place. 2 is we're rocking it. So you score yourself on one of those 3 for each of the 45 criteria, and it basically spits out. You get the overall score, like for all 3 tiers, whatever elementary school is at 75% fidelity, and even I look at that graph and be like, all right, what does that mean? That tells me nothing other than like, if I was to fill a bucket that was shaped like a triangle, we'd be at like 75%. Like that's all it would tell me. So I like looking a little bit deeper, and I can look at like, okay, how well implemented are your universal systems? So at tier 1, how well implemented are systems at tier 2 and tier 3? And then you can go even further, and it breaks down, like on this graph, for example, you can look at the different aspects that it measures within each tier. So looking at tier 1 specifically, there's the teaming aspects, the implementation aspects, and the evaluation aspects. So teaming is, do you have a team? Do they have roles? Do you meet regularly? Does everyone know what they're supposed to do? And are you doing the tasks your team is supposed to be doing? Implementation probably has the most questions assigned to it. Is, are you explicitly teaching your school-wide behaviors? Do you even have established and published school-wide behaviors? Do you have, community involvement? That's a huge piece, having some sort of parent voice on the universal team. So most of the questions are dedicated to the implementation, and then evaluation is, it is kind of silly, but not silly, but it's like, hey, are we actually,
Hello, is that Eloise?
are we actually checking
Want to dance right
whether
now?
or not we're doing, getting some feedback. Are we actually evaluating our efforts over time? So we used to always, like in the district I was working in, we used to always joke, I was like, well, evaluation, we should be doing really well because I'm forcing you to do the TFI. That's basically what I was telling them. So part of the process is like, are we looking at how well we're doing, at least on an annual basis? So you can kind of look at these in that granular nature, and you can get even more granular, like that graph you saw in the previous slide was, we call it the items graph, and you can look at your answer on each question, and you can look at it over time. So if you're using the TFI over subsequent years or each session you're taking it, you can kind of see how your self-rating has gone on that. So you can see where you're dropping off, or where you're showing improvement, or you're maintaining. So, or if you see zeros across one of them, which happens sometimes, you can say, all right, are we avoiding actually trying to get student family involvement on this team, which happens a lot. I mean, it's hard as schools to say like, yeah, come on in, family, look at what we're doing. I think that has its own pieces, like, hey, let's make sure our house is in order before we invite families in. But oftentimes you can get your house in order quicker when they're there. So it's just that you can keep slicing it deeper and deeper to get more granular each time.
Okay, so I'm going to ask kind of like a hypothetical question looking at this data. So I'm looking at this data, and it looks like tier 2 stuff is kind of starting to take a little bit of a decline, but the tier 2 stuff has shown like gains kind of over time. So like as a team member, I would kind of pay attention to the reduction in tier 1 and the increase in tier 2 and how that may be impacting other things that are happening from like an academic or behavioral standpoint with other data that's being collected. Is that kind of a way to use this to triangulate information?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I think that, the TFI is a tool that you always want to hold up against something else, because this is just measuring that fidelity. So it's how well we're doing what we said we're going to do. I'd also want to look at what student outcomes are like. And in this case, I think if you look at the dates on this specific school's situation, it's not surprising that tier 2 was able to kind of take off, because one assumption I might have is like, okay, during this we entered a pandemic and we didn't have access to students in a traditional fashion in a lot of cases. So in the background, we were able to set up some more systems. We always made the joke of like, we can't always build the plane while we're flying it, and for a little while last spring and even like throughout this year, we landed the plane a little bit. So we had a little bit of time to meet and set up some systems. But I would always hold this up against, other factors that are going on. Like, okay, we are seeing that decline in implementation at tier 1. Are we just letting off the gas? Are we getting comfortable? What other things are happening? Has our workforce turned over? When's the last time we did some explicit PBIS training in our district? And maybe all the teachers in our building, maybe 30–40% of them are new, and they didn't have that year 1 training in our first year of implementation. So this is sort of like that early warning system to be like, hey, guess what? We got to reboot some of this training. Or, oops, did we steal all of our expertise for implementation out of our tier 1 or universal teams, and are they now sitting on tier 2 or intervention teams? So a lot of this is the beginning of the point where you ask some questions and you balance it across some other data, like you were saying.
So as it says on this slide, like it's really useful in root cause analysis. So instead of just being like, oh, here's our assumption about what's happening, let's use this to kind of get curious and dig into more data to really find out what's the reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Awesome. All right, so before we start talking about like the real like school improvement planning and action planning process, we want to make sure that you guys are following along with us. So is this making sense? Do you get it? Like if you're completely lost, let us know. We'll try to fill in. All right, and it looks like the good news, RJ, is that everybody is either like, we have about 47% of the people who completely get it, and then the other half are at kind of sort of, but no one is completely lost. So I think we're making some sense to most of the people in our webinar. And
I think that's expected. I mean, my assumption, and I guess this assumption is like, I mean, I would be if this was the first time I was hearing about the TFI, I'd be in the kind of sort of get it. Like I'm sort of have to mess around with it kind of person to figure out how it works. And I think just the reality is we don't have time in an hour-and-a-half webinar to dig into that tool completely. But I'm sure we can find some other opportunities. So yeah.
Awesome. And we do have one person who's completely lost. So to that person who's completely lost, please hang on to the end so that we can answer any questions you might have. All right. Hold on, let me make sure I'm okay. So now we're going to talk about like, what does it look like in real life school improvement planning process? Not just from like a hypothetical standpoint, but like, what can it look like for school teams who are engaged in school improvement planning? A lot of schools are getting ready to submit school improvement plans. A lot of districts have just submitted recovery plans around this work. And so really taking a moment to talk about the improvement priorities that are happening across schools and districts. So as I mentioned before, there are district recovery plans that were recently submitted to OSPI on June 1st. And those recovery plans required schools to look at specific student groups. They required districts to look at student and adult well-being. They required they were also required to look at like academic recovery and what kinds of processes are going to be put in place to support that. A lot of schools are, like all schools across Washington, are also expected and required to write school improvement plans. And some schools are even expected and required to submit them into OSPI for feedback and monitoring. Kind of top of mind for a lot of people as we're returning to in-person instruction from this COVID-19 global pandemic that kind of just impacted us on a global level and definitely impacted education on a global level. This return to in-person instruction, how do we engage and re-engage students? How do we ensure that students who we haven't been able to contact over the last year are in attendance? So there are a lot of improvement priorities that districts and schools are paying attention to. And it sounds like the TFI is a tool that may be really helpful in organizing information, understanding information, and being able to kind of provide direction for schools and districts as they're trying to determine what their priorities are as they're moving into the next school year.
Yeah, so I think, that as we look at, reestablishing those safe and inviting, school environments for students, I think that the TFI definitely does a fantastic job of being a easily deployed measure to look at, again, those internal systems, like, how safe and welcoming is our school, and how quickly can we make small adjustments to support all students as students are coming back in. So I think it allows us to maximize, the level of sensitivity that we can kind of look at our practice to look at where to improve before it becomes something that's like trying to turn the Titanic around. So it allows us with enough sensitivity to make some improvements on the fly to improve outcomes for all students through making our schools safe and welcoming environments.
Nice. All right, so let's talk about when we're doing improvement planning, how can this data and this information really kind of drive, inform, as Hugh said in the comments, help us ask the right questions around kind of where we want to be pointing those priorities.
Yeah, thank you, Hugh, for that. I mean, that is true. Data is only the beginning of the conversation, the questioning process. So I think, how, as far as like school improvement planning, the TFI gives us, it becomes one of the legs of the stool, so to speak, where to, I think from a 10,000 foot perspective, we're looking at, we want positive student outcomes. The entire goal of, education is to provide for positive post-secondary outcomes for students, right? So if we can measure that through academics, but that's one piece of it, and like I said before, creating safe and welcoming environments allows students to come in and take those academic risks to learn at a greater rate. So if we can measure that core piece, like the sort of the social, emotional, and the behavioral components of our school system, we can take that into our school improvement planning process and come up with some very targeted goals. So like, hey, this year we are, we're going to increase, the fidelity of implementation for PBIS, but we're going to do it focusing on feedback and acknowledgement. We know that students, we always get more of what we call out. So if we're going to call out more of the positive behavior, we're going to see more of that and turn that trajectory. So we could take that and we can balance that with some student outcome data, so if we say like, hey, we're going to increase this, and we should see a decrease in office referrals and suspensions, or, negative consequences for students, so to speak. So I think it becomes, it can't be the sole thing that's used in school improvement planning, but it becomes that measure internally that should support, like, yep, student outcomes are improving, And it's because we said we did the thing we're going to do, and here's how we measured it, and we're going to do more of it in the next cycle. So it's really that piece that proves that our behavior, our deliberate behavior, and what we said we were going to do provided for the student outcome. It wasn't just luck, so to speak.
So as I've been like teaching and administering and then working in the land and world of continuous improvement, as with like all things in education, nothing is like siloed or done individually. Like everything is connected to everything else, right? Like you need to be able to have reading skills to apply to math. You need to be able to have social emotional skills to apply to all levels of academic processes. And as I kind of gain more and more understanding around all this process, one thing that keeps coming up is that in order for students to be successful in social emotional learning, the two components, and this is like research-based, that have to be in place are, it has to be like embedded into the culture of the learning environment. And it's only as successful as the adults' capacities and capabilities within the building. And so it seems like the TFI is a really, like a really good accountability tool around how to measure that adult behavior to help increase and implement that social emotional aspect for students.
Yeah, so I mean, we always look at like, are the students connecting with the work? Are they connecting with the school? And the reality is like the TFI is kind of a measure of the adults. And if the adults aren't connected, I forget where I heard this, if the adults aren't connected, there's no way the students are connected. So this is that piece to make sure that like, all right, we as a school team are keeping an eye on this. We all have a different stake. We all have a different like lens to view this through, but we're connected around this. Therefore, the results should show that the students are then more connected.
Great. So it's also a tool to like hold the adults accountable to help meet student needs using a variety of measurements, data collection, questioning, and activities to implement that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Andrea talks about how does this honestly work into a school day on top of everything else. So one thing we may have missed is how often this gets implemented. So let's backtrack. How often do you do the TFI?
So that's kind of a depends answer. At least annually, ideally twice. But in some cases, upwards of 3 or 4, depending on, so I would say in a perfect world, you're doing it kind of twice a year, the whole thing, and you may pull out different components. You may pull out like just looking at tier 2 or tier 3 at different times during the year, depending on what your school needs or at what year of implementation you're at. You may really want to kind of focus more frequently at the beginning and then taper off to maintain as your school is more rooted in MTSS or PBIS behavior. But ideally, so I think the question about like what does this look like day to day? So I think when this gets done, this highlights some areas that the universal team that says like, okay, this might be our focus for the year. Whether or not that ends up in the school improvement plan or not, it's highlighted as like here are some areas we know that we can improve upon. And then it becomes some of those, between staff meetings with administration, like, okay, hey, look, we're looking at teaching school-wide expectations more regularly. Like this is something we're working on, like we're checking on it. And then administration then puts in, PBIS is more for adults than students. So the folks in leadership then begin like at part of like walkthroughs and pop-ins begin providing that positive feedback on like, hey, I saw you teaching expectations embedded in your content. Fantastic. It's that idea of like this, that's how you then improve that culture within your school as far as the teaching of school-wide expectations. And then feedback and acknowledgement, same thing. Like if you're looking at that as an area of improvement, you then that becomes sort of the cycle of at a staff meeting, like, hey, look, we're seeing that we're sort of like falling off on our feedback and acknowledgement. Let's try to work on this, and then providing staff and everyone else with that positive reinforcement when they're doing it. So it's like taking PBIS and scaling it up a little bit for the adults in the building as well.
So it's not taking all 45 items and figuring out how to implement all 45 things within the context of like, we got to do all the things. It's like you were saying, it's like, how can you be as lazy as possible by making the biggest impact? So it's like taking the path of least resistance. So that's how you can itemize, like prioritize what the adults in the building have capacity for to make the biggest bang for the buck, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, maybe my analogy of being lazy was wrong, but it's like the idea of like, again, you can't be like, all right, by the end of the year, we're going to be 2s across the board in all 45. That's just not realistic in most implementation phases. As a school is going through its implementation, like each tier, like so tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 are like 3 to 5 year implementation like timelines. So it takes some time to build these systems into place because we have natural staff turnover, we have natural administration changes. So it's building this system. It's more like watching the stock market go up. It bounces and it takes big dips sometimes, but that's what it looks like. And then after a number of years of doing this, when you're closer to like that high fidelity, then you're making those minor changes. At the very beginning, there's always some heavy lifting. So, I think there was a question around like, was like day to day, like in your first couple of years, like, yeah, it's all about PBIS and everyone's behind it and everyone's drinking the Kool-Aid, but I think, as you get further, it becomes part of the culture. So that momentum is there and it's carrying it, and you just make minor tweaks here and there as things change, or sometimes some bigger ones if there's bigger environmental changes or pandemics or who knows. So I think, day to day, it's one of those things where like you don't run the TFI every day. Like it's like a fall or a winter as you're wherever you're in that cycle of school improvement planning. Typically you want it to run it, in a way where you can digest the information and it can become part of the plan for next year.
Okay, and it's really those like baseline and then longer term outcome measures.
Yeah.
As they get implemented. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's talk about the information a district can get from the TFI. What kind of data can it get?
So a district can, if multiple schools or ideally all schools in the district are using the TFI as their fidelity measure, and it's part of the annual evaluation calendar within the district, a district can pull that information sort of and pull it together in like an aggregate and look at like, okay, as a district, we're 100 or 63%, implemented at team composition. So we can look at that and be like, okay, we can make district level decisions to support school level, improvement plans, if that makes sense. So if it's like, okay, hey, like we're seeing that like student family involvement is like way low. One of those things that we can do is say like, hey, that's the push this year from a district level. So we're going to reduce barriers to schools for you to achieve this so that your school improvement plans are now aligned with district's strategic plan, based on fidelity data we have here, and again, this isn't the only measure. We would balance that with other, student outcome data, and other environmental data coming in. But I think, if the more schools within a district that would be using a common tool like this, the more the district can be part of that cascading model of supports for their buildings.
Awesome. So I recently looked at a school improvement plan, and that it was an elementary school improvement plan, and they had a number of different types of data that were included in the plan. So they were looking at, so this was this year, so there was no SBA data to look at. So they used the STAR screener for reading and math. They looked at ELPA 21 for their English learner progress. They used Fontes and Pinella reading running records to measure kind of reading levels. And then they had the Panorama Student Staff Community Survey that they used to kind of measure early warning systems, student well-being, and social emotional learning. And then they also used the PBIS Tiered Fidelity Inventory. So they used a number of data points within their school improvement plan to talk about it. And so in the plan, this is how it was used. So this is what they reported out. So they said that we are nearly finished with our tier 1 review, and our tier implementation score has increased from roughly 37% to about 60% in half a year's time. Next steps to identify priority areas for our action plan. So they did a tier 1 review and saw that from like what they initially had, 6 months later, they increased from 37 to 60% across the board. And then they're going to use that to then determine what they need to prioritize for their action plan. So they're not going to take all of the things all the data. They're just saying that we have this data. And then they were talking about tiers 2 and 3 progress monitoring was completed on 2/10 and 2/11. I'm not sure what that means. And tier 2 and 3 TFI scores for the past 3 years had no data points on prior TFI evaluations in the building prior to TFI evaluation 2016 to 2019. So since September of 2020, both tiers have now been monitored, and we're working on next steps to identify priority areas for an action plan for each tier. We were now able to complete a mid-year baseline for tier 2 and tier 3 inventory using our TFI tool. So tier 2 received a baseline score of 8 out of 26, or 31% for implementation and fidelity. And tier 3 received a baseline score of 7 out of 34, or 21% for implementation and fidelity. And this was done, I want to say, so this was since September of 2020, and I think this was progress monitoring for this year. So they did their TFI in the middle of COVID.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, that's, this points at one of the things that, it was always echoing in the back of my head. Like we pay attention to that which we measure. If we're not actively measuring something or progress monitoring it, it gets easily forgotten until the end of the year. And we're like, oh, holy cow, scores didn't improve, or we're not doing this any better. Well, we were never measuring it to begin with. We weren't progress monitoring or monitoring our progress on it at all. So I think, this hits to the heart of that. We're like, as soon as, I don't know what school this is, but as soon as they started measuring it, it jumped. It's like, oh, because we're paying attention to it now. And it's one of those things where like, oh, okay, I can reflect upon my adult behavior within the system now because I can see how to measure it. Before I was just like, I thought I was doing it right, but if there's different things I can look at, like it provides me some more guidance. So yeah. And plenty of schools, you mentioned them using it during the pandemic. Yeah, the context of what instruction looked like changed, and what the building day looked like changed for a lot of schools during the pandemic, but you can still measure it. There were certain areas that did dip just because we were trying to relearn some of it, but it becomes one of those things where schools that saw a lesser dip, one of the things that can be construed out of that is like, okay, systems were better in place. The impact of the pandemic hit schools that had some of these things in place a little bit less. So
yeah, I found that a lot of schools recognized that they needed they needed some kind of PBIS in place, or they needed like an MTSS model in place, or something to measure adult behavior that's impacting student behavior, or social emotional needs, or well-being type stuff in the midst of this, right? And so if you have something that's measuring or kind of paying attention to like, hey, we still need to be talking about expectations and routines even if we're on Zoom, or we still need to be like, letting people know like what we're proud of, or we still need so kind of measuring these elements, whether it's tier 1 elements or tier 2, tier 3 elements, they're still needed even if we're expected to teach in the midst of a global pandemic. So I found this data really fascinating. We recently got their updated data, so I'm really interested to look through and see what they've then have been able to measure since this initial baseline data was provided. But I just wanted to talk about, this is like a real life example of data that's been included in a school improvement plan around the TFI. So yeah, oh, sorry, Kepi made the slides all pretty. Thanks, Kepi. So 94%, I guess they did this with the faculty involvement, the critical feature on the faculty involvement. And in their end of year PBIS survey from spring 2020, it said 95 or 94% of the staff said they felt respected from administrators to staff, which was better from prior years. And then 80% said there was support from current administrators was much better than prior years. So I guess it also pays attention to like the impact leadership has on staff impact as well.
Yeah, I mean, we know that building leaders are the culture setters or the culture curators for their building. So I think, you know, the more, I mean, it's like, I think, you know, we hit on that like during the last slide, like the idea like, okay, like we've switched what school looks like, you know, if we're going to look at how well we're doing remote learning, you know, some of us have to be taught what remote learning is. Like, it's sort of like, okay, if I'm a teacher and my evaluator is coming in to look at what I'm doing, but they're basing my practice on what it looked like in the classroom, it's different. It's not, that doesn't really do me anything to give me feedback on how I'm doing in a remote environment. So everyone kind of has to be retaught a little bit. So the same thing with the TFI or using, you know, any sort of thing around PBIS. If you change the setting, you've got to change everyone's behavior within it to have, you know, positive outcomes, specifically the adults. And that's where leadership comes in to sort of say like, okay, hold on a minute. Like, what is it the outcome we want? How do we know the student's doing it? And therefore, what is the teacher or the staff input we need to put in there to produce that outcome, and how are we going to measure it?
Awesome. Yeah. All right. So now is the opportunity for some Q&A. And I'm guessing that RJ will probably be answering most of these questions. But we want to open it up to all of you, as opposed to having a breakout session. Really just ensure that we're answering questions we can. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
I saw the one in the chat. So how can administrators be held accountable? And, you know, I think, you know, if a district is using this tool, I mean, so the TFI becomes part of the school report card to whoever that principal or assistant principal, whoever their evaluator is. So if the accountability is there for them, then I think, you know, it is through this being part of that report card, so to speak. And I think report card sounds a bit harsh, but it's part of the data that then informs, you know, outcome results for the principal's leadership skills.
Hi, I have a question. So I'm really curious, like, I'm a post teacher, and I want to be involved more as a community member, having had the skills of being a teacher. And I feel like there's such opportunity for connecting with communities in terms of teaching the school standards and the expectations. Like, can you talk a little bit about any like experiences with partnering, like with telling your community about your expectations from your school?
Yeah, so I mean, you bring up a good point, Rob, and I think the TFI highlights that because it's one of the measures, you know, that we want, you know, in order to be at Fidelity, you've got to have some sort of community involvement. I think some of the best ways are, you know, I mean, so lack of in-person meetings, like I think during, you know, curriculum nights or community nights or open houses, you know, I think that's a time to talk about like, hey, this is, you know, we in our building rely on expectations over rules, expectations being what we want to see you doing rather than what we don't want to see you doing as students. You know, and I think the more we can weave that language into student and staff handbooks, the better. And additionally, like when communication comes out, you know, talking about like if thinking one of the old schools, like the Cougar Way at whatever school, like I think that's, highlighting what those expectations are, a great way to link to families, so that families can be like, oh, okay, cool. This is what you're expected to do at school. How does that translate at home, and vice versa? So I think having that family, or that family, that student input, depending on the level, at that universal level is really key. And and I know it's hard for schools. I think there's a hesitancy because it's sort of like, no, this is school, we do our thing. But I think we're realizing more and more that figuring out those partnerships and a two-way communication and a two-way communication and partnership is having much better outcomes for students.
I have a question. I'm wondering, I noticed in the MTSS framework that it references a reading tiered fidelity inventory, and just wondering if there will be an opportunity to learn more about that.
Yes, that will be coming. I don't know. So I'm not a reading specialist. So science of reading will not be me, but if it's the system around, like, how do we ensure that, that we're providing universal access to great core instruction for all students, and so that we're not trying to intervene or accommodate our way out of poor instruction. That's where the MTSS systems come into the reading piece, and the reading TFI, or the RTFI, takes a look at those systems. So yeah, there will be, I'm sure there will be more information on that coming out.
Thank you.
RJ, there's a question in the chat that asks, are there elements in the TFI that reflect the value of student leadership and the role they play in school culture if given voice and power to support this work?
So with that level of, other than participation on the team and providing input, so I think if, I don't have it open in front of me, I should, but I think it's one of the questions at tier 1 for implementation. So yeah, so I think having family or student voice on that team. So I think we end up with more student voice at the secondary level on those teams. Mostly, part of it is due to schedules and availability to be on the teams. But yes, I mean, for teams that are doing it well, to score yourself a true 2, would have to have kind of both those components at that secondary level. And we've seen some elementary schools with 5th and 4th graders joining some of those teams, as they get into the higher grades. But yeah, they're, to measure it to how well their voice is heard, probably not. There are other tools that do dovetail nicely with the TFI, different cultural surveys, or self-assessment surveys that are available through some of the similar platforms that can kind of cross-cut with the TFI to get that student voice. But as far as the TFI itself measuring that, it's not as granular as as that question would indicate.
Well, Liza and RJ, we do have time for breakout rooms if you'd like to. Do you want a shot?
Sure. I think
Okay.
do we have a breakout question? Yes.
We do. Yes, we do. I was mistaken early on.
Oh, and it looks like Hugh, who is one of our continuous improvement partners and has a lot, I believe he's on the board of Northwest PBIS. So he knows a lot about PBIS in Washington State. And I see that he's posted in the chat 1.11 student family community involvement. Stakeholders, students, families, and community members provide input on universal foundations, which include expectations, consequences, acknowledgements, at least every 12 months. So, and again, from what I've heard in this presentation, is the TFI is really a focus on how consistent adults are in implementing behaviors that provide supports to students, and less a focus on how students are engaging within the context of those supports. Is that correct?
Yeah.
RJ? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So it doesn't really, I mean, it's that, like I said, it's like that third leg of the stool. Like it balances those student outcomes with, with the intentions So if we say yep, we're going to teach behaviors better, but then student outcomes don't change, but we also took a measure and we looked at ourselves and we realized we didn't actually do it. Well, it shouldn't be a surprise that student outcomes didn't change. But if we said, yeah, we're going to teach it better, and we also didn't do anything, but then they got better, we can't really give that action credit because we didn't do anything. You know what I mean? So it's like the idea of it's a measure of did we get lucky by saying we're going to do this and it happened? Or did we say we're going to do this, we actually did it, and it provided a positive outcome? It may also not provide a positive outcome, in which case our measurement showed oh, shoot, we had the wrong strategy. But it is that measure of here's our hypothesis of how we're going to get there. Here's what we're going to do. Did it change? So.
All right. So Bonnie, are we ready for?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I have the rooms all set up, and I was going to let people know if you get into a breakout room and there's nobody there, come back to the main room and we'll find a spot for you. 10 minutes. Do you think 10 minutes that'll bring us back at about, why don't we make it just 7 minutes? How's that?
That works.
Okay.
All right. And the prompt is, and I see Megan's put it in the chat, with the lens of your role, how can the TFI support and inform your work towards continuous improvement? And that's at the school level and district level. I mean, you could probably use it for continuous improvement in all areas, but this is specific to school and district work.
Okay, I'm going to open the rooms. So, Jenna, let me see if we can assign you to a room.
I was all by myself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's the first time it's happened all day today. It was nice.
And what room were you in?
I was in 5.
You were in 5.
Bonnie, I was in 6.
Okay, is that Ron?
Yes, we had a similar problem.
And nobody else was there?
Nobody was there.
Okay.
Maybe I didn't wait long enough.
So Jenna, I see where you left 5. So let me see if I can, do you have a little button at the bottom on your toolbar that says breakout rooms?
I do.
Okay, why don't you join room 6?
Okay.
And Ron, I see where there are a couple of people are in room 6 now. So if you want to rejoin it. Everybody else good?
Yeah, I'm going to go hop into a room, Bonnie.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I might go hop in one real quick.
Thanks, RJ.
Yep.
Hey, Bonnie, just to let you know, your slides are flipped. We can see your notes on there when we come back.
Okay, I'll move them back. Maybe. There we go. Let's give it a shot. How's
Perfect.
that? Thank you.
I always forget to pause the recording until we're like part way through. Like, oh, no one wants to listen to us explaining all this stuff.
That's fine, Janae. We're okay with that. We're just happy you're here. I see people are popping back in. I hope you had a good, I know, brief discussion. We're coming up on 4:30 and I know you're anxious to get on with your afternoon. So we're going to launch the GATE evaluation poll for you to take while we talk about a few resources and things that are coming up. Again, it'll take a couple minutes for you to take it. You have to answer all the questions before you can submit. So the GATE evaluation, we really want to know how you feel. We use this information planning for next year and improving on what we do, always in a cycle of continuous improvement. So please be honest with us. We do have some resources that we'd like to share with you. There are 2 previous GATE equity webinars that were focusing on the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. They're in our archives. We'll provide the link for you, the CISL program guide on SEL programs, the CISL or the Center for Improvement of Student Learning website, our website at System and School Improvement. And then we always have what we call the green button. You go to the OSPI or the Office of System and School Improvement website and ask for personal assistance. And whether or not we can answer your question, we will point you in the right direction and get somebody that can answer your question for you. We challenge you to either discuss your ideas with your leadership, share your ideas with your PLC, or maybe lead a discussion with students. We publish a monthly newsletter, a System and School Improvement newsletter, and we typically focus on a topic. And this month it was improvement science. We put the link in the chat so you can read it. We archive all of our newsletters so you can go back and read past editions, or you can sign up and receive the newsletter right around the first of every month. I'm Bonnie Zimmerman, Liza Hartlyn, and RJ Monton. This is our contact information. If you have more questions, please feel free to contact us. So we're winding up for the year. This is the last Gate Equity webinar in this series, and we'll see you back in the fall. We're going to focus on attendance in August. The registration information is not available yet, but we have all of your email addresses, so we'll send it to you as soon as it's ready. And I want to wish you a restful summer and hope that the fall brings us all back in person. Bye now.
I saw a question in the chat about clock hours. After this event, we'll go in and verify your attendance, and then you'll be prompted to complete a survey. And then once that's all done, your clock hours will be on your transcript.
Kathleen, I see you started a question but didn't finish it. Do you have something for me?
I just want to tell you that I've loved all these classes and learning all this new stuff as a retired teacher. And I hope you have Zoom in the fall so I can still participate. It makes me feel, so great to be able to learn new things about what's going on in the education world. I was a teacher for almost 40 years. I have administrative credentials, counseling credentials, and all kinds of teaching credentials. So for me, everything that you've done has touched me in different ways. So thank you for allowing this.
Oh, gosh, thank you for showing up every month and being a Gate faithful. We appreciate you being here.
Well, I have loved it. So thank you very, 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 very much. You have made my day more than once.
Thank you.
All righty.
You.
Bye. And
Bye-bye.
have a great summer.
You too.
Okay.
Right.
I think